For Laura, I have a question of comparison, because I had the feeling that you have a very limited use of comparison. Comparison helps you to say that Ukrainian public action, Ukrainian state is dealing the crisis all like all other states deal. But I think comparison may bring you more, especially when you know and you know other experiences of those emergency situations. Because comparing, for example, Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, through comparison, you may show us circulation of knowledge, circulation of models, helping IDPs, assisting IDPs, circulation of different dispositives concerning IDPs. So my question is about comparison. It would be also for you an occasion to develop a bit on the comparison and the role of comparison. And the same question actually for Greta, but a little bit different. Among your interviewees, you have Crimean IDPs from Crimea, and you have also from the west, from the east, if I understand it correctly. What comparison helps you? I mean, in your presentation, you showed us similarities. Do you have some differences also between, in terms of feelings, between IDPs from the east and IDPs from Crimea? Political agency, for example. Yeah.
Thanks for the question. I think that's one thing I need to flesh out in my paper is a better comparison. As I was getting towards the end of my paper, that was the element that I think needs to be further developed. But one thing about the comparison that's really interesting is that a lot of people compared the Ukrainian response to Georgia, to Armenia, to Azerbaijan, but then they also compared it to Syria, South Sudan, and Yemen, which are other large humanitarian crises. And so, which when you think about the climate and think about the type of needs, they're really different. So Ukraine, that's why the Ukrainian government, I believe, has relied a bit more on the knowledge from Georgia. In fact, they've nicknamed the UN house in Kyiv as the Georgian house because there are so many Georgians working for the United Nations to help facilitate the response because they have the experience and the institutional knowledge to be able to do that. And so I mean, and when you're comparing the Ukrainian crisis to other crises that are happening in the world today, it's very different. I mean, one of the ladies in the quotes in my paper talked about how, in South Sudan or Syria, you need a tent that you can put up to help the IDPs and house them. In Ukraine, you can't do that because of the winter. So in a way, the humanitarian agencies are also dealing with a new crisis because their knowledge now is based on a very different climate, a very less developed countries. And also, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the Ukrainian government capacity, which, needs some work, but compared to Syria and compared to other countries that have dealt with humanitarian crises, the Ukrainian government's capacity to respond to this crisis is actually significantly more. And they have a social structure, a social assistance structure that is actually established that they can, just rework a little bit to be able to give this type of assistance. So the comparisons, I need to work it out a little bit more. But yeah, most of the comparisons have been to Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and they're learning from the Georgian experience by actually having Georgians come and work for the United Nations to assist with their institutional knowledge from the crisis.
Thank you very much. I have a question actually on the political use of IDPs. Julia was mentioning Georgia, and in Georgia, IDPs were kept living in a limbo for 20 years as a constant, if you want, I mean, they were kept hostage of their status of IDPs as a constant reminder of the injustice of the war that they were kept out. So there were people who lived in very temporary accommodations for 20 years. Now, I could be mistaken, but I don't seem to have heard any sort of narrative along these lines in Ukraine. I wonder whether, I mean, you have a feeling that, I mean, this has basically been used only as it's not come up in the political debate. It's only been discussed in practical terms. Local authorities, national authorities, civil society organizations that really needed to deal with this crisis. What is your feeling?
Yeah, so the Georgian government, the Georgian government, a lot of times they said that they didn't place people in permanent housing because then that would actually recognize that they knew that there was no end to the political crisis and they knew they were not going to get back Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So I think that there's a lot of underlying political connotations. So the Georgian experience is that, yeah, basically, 9 years is what they waited to be able to do anything, and they didn't want to settle people in permanent housing because to do so would be to recognize that they knew that they weren't going to get that territory back, and that is something that the government was not willing to do. I think in contrast to the Ukrainian situation, the displacement that we've seen, it's only been a year, which I'm sure to the IDPs that I talked about, there were people who could tell me the number of days they'd been displaced. So to those people, displacement is a big issue and something that they deal with every single day. But in comparison to Georgia, to Armenia, we've seen the displacement is so much shorter that I think that's why we haven't seen those types of narratives. And again, these collective centers that the people are based in, sometimes they're fit for winter, sometimes they're not. They're not permanent structures, but we've seen a lot of people go and live with their friends and things like that. So I think that while the Ukrainian government they've given a bit of housing to people, they haven't systematically tried to, house the large number of IDPs that are out there. I heard that there are only about 50,000 places for people in collective centers around Ukraine. And if you're talking about 1.4 million people that are displaced, those numbers definitely don't add up at all. So I think that there's that caveat, but again, we're dealing with such a short time frame compared to the Georgian and Armenian situations that I think that's why we haven't dealt with it.
Jesse?
Greta, this is just fantastic stuff, and different research designs are good for different kinds of things, and you're doing great representational work, so thank you a lot for doing it. I just wanted to give you a chance to make good on your claim to tell us about the steppe stories and the representation of the, either in music or in song, of like steppe imagery that you said was that came out in your interview data. I'm
Okay.
like genuinely interested in that.
Right. So there were many, many different markers of a common Ukrainian, Crimean Tatar identity that were identified. And the narrative went that we are the same people. We roamed the same steppe prior to the formation of the Ukrainian nation. We see that in the dress of the Cossacks is actually Crimean Tatar. So that was one thing, right? And they would sort of put to the side the fact that Crimean Tatars and the Cossacks were not typically fighting on the same side. The other marker was common wedding rituals, right? So as soon as Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians started getting together and talking to each other and visiting each other, they found all of these customs in villages, the wedding ritual happening on two sides of the family on different nights, different things about about going to somebody's house with something and then not returning empty-handed, right? All of these village customs were the same. And then the third thing was that Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians have begun to form musical groups and make music together, and they are identifying songs in which the lyrics might be in different languages, but the melodies are exactly the same. And so it's just this explosion of creativity where all of a sudden they realize all of this they have so much in common. And the idea is that it's the Russians that have kept them apart so long, for what that's worth. And I think that when we play these narratives off of, for example, the work that Wilson has done on history, like it doesn't hold ground in like the military sense, right? But in the cultural sense, right, of the costumes or whatever, it's